this afternoon's event. The panel event is about a report that we published that we entitled "A Policy for Equality, Menstrual Pain as a Workplace Issue." My name is Shannon, and I'll be chairing the event this afternoon. I'd like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which this Zoom event takes place. I want to pay my respects to the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the Kulin Nations, the Wurundjeri people, which is where our report primarily took place in terms of the researching, surveying, drafting process. So just for a bit of background as to why we're all here and the purpose of the event. So through Liberty Victoria's Rights Advocacy Project, my team and I, who consist of Sophie Lloyd, Abbey Dalton, Sophia McNamara and Tim Cronin, we wrote a report on menstrual leave, which we're excited to be launching with you all this afternoon. We wouldn't have gotten here but for the great advice and supervision of our three wonderful supervisors, Diane White, Sam Moorhead and Gemma Caparella, who is also one of our panelists this afternoon. So thank you all so much for your ongoing support over more than 2 years. We really appreciate it. So our team ultimately decided to write a report on menstrual leave because we saw how prevalent menstrual pain, symptoms and conditions were in the general population. We also observed that statutory leave entitlements for the majority of workers is inadequate. For full-time workers, most of the time, they're entitled to 10 days of paid personal leave, also known as sick leave, per year. As you can imagine, if you're enduring menstrual pain and symptoms on a monthly or even more frequent basis, you're quickly going to burn through those 10 days of paid precious leave, especially in a pandemic, or if you've got other illnesses or disabilities, if you're a parent or a carer. We don't think workers should really have to choose between taking unpaid leave in order to take care of themselves or try and power through a shift so they get paid. We think the burden should rest with employers to ensure that workers aren't financially disadvantaged for taking that needed time off. We're really hopeful that the report and the panel event can encourage people to talk to as many people as they can get their hands on about menstrual leave, especially co-workers. We're really hopeful that workers can talk among one another, organise and collectivise around this issue and push their bosses into implementing paid menstrual leave. So the model that we adopted throughout the report was 12 days of paid menstrual leave that is in addition to current paid leave entitlements. We also propose that medical evidence, such as a medical certificate, is not required in order for workers to access that paid leave entitlement. The different models of menstrual and reproductive leave can be something we can talk to more throughout the panel. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Firstly, Kate Marshall, who is an industrial officer and the Assistant State Secretary of the Health and Community Services Union, known as HACSU, which is a Victorian union supporting over 10,000 members who are working in mental health, disability and drug and alcohol services. Recently, the HACSU launched its Reproductive Health and Wellbeing Leave campaign, which is one of the first menstrual-related leave campaigns in Australia's history. Thanks so much for joining us, Kate. We also have with us Gemma Caparella. Not a problem. We also have with us Gemma Caparella, who is a barrister and practices in public law, which includes discrimination and sexual harassment matters. Gemma is the chair of Liberty Victoria's Government Regulation and Equality Committee. As I mentioned earlier, also a supervisor for the RAP. Gemma also has endometriosis and adenomyosis. Welcome, Gemma. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on the panel.
Not a problem. Joining us also is Mary Crooks, who is the Executive Director of the Victorian Women's Trust, which is a research and advocacy organisation focused on equality for women, girls and gender diverse people. The Victorian Women's Trust was one of Australia's first employers to introduce paid menstrual leave and flexible working arrangements. It also advocates for the wider adoption of similar policies. Mary has overseen the research and publication of About Bloody Time, the menstrual revolution we have to have, as well as Ourselves at Work, creating positive menstrual culture in your workplace. Thanks so much for being here, Mary. Okay, I'd like to kick things off by going to you first, Gemma, if you can shed some light on your experiences with endometriosis and adenomyosis. First of all, what are these conditions and what kind of impact has that had on your life and your working life?
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Shannon. And I have to say there's nothing I like more than talking about my period in large groups of people. And I think that's something that really comes through in the excellent report that you have all written, is the need to really break down some of the stigma and taboo, because so many of us have periods and so many of us have symptoms that affect our ability to work associated with our periods. So I am unfortunate enough to be in the category of 1 in 10 people who menstruate who have endometriosis. So what it is it's a condition where your body, quite evilly, I might say, produces cells that are similar to the lining that normally lines the uterus and swells and bleeds when the body tells it to do that. And that is essentially what a period is. My body and many other people's bodies produce similar cells in places that are not the inside of the uterus. So I have had a few surgeries over the years, and it's been found weirdly on in places like the ligaments that hold my my uterus to the back of my pelvis, and other areas outside the uterus where it shouldn't be. I also have been diagnosed with adenomyosis, which is a condition where those cells not only sit superficially in places where they shouldn't be, but grow through the uterus wall. So what that means is that the endometriosis is incredibly painful. What happens is that when you get your period, your body sends messages through hormones to those cells to swell and bleed, but because they're not on the inside of the uterus, they've got nowhere to go. And so basically there are, as I understand it, kind of sores inside your body. Endometriosis basically has no effective diagnostic tool, no treatment, and no cure. So the kinds of treatments you get are the human guinea pig treatments, where doctors like to occasionally slice you open and have a look at what's going on inside and either burn or cut off endometriosis. Those treatments are not available for adenomyosis because it permeates the muscle wall. So that's endo and adeno, as they're called, in a bit of a nutshell. I started experiencing symptoms when I was 17 or 18. I'm now 34. I've still never had an effective treatment for my condition. I live periodically with chronic debilitating pain, and I try as much as I possibly can to power on through with it. But my experience of having those conditions at work has been difficult. I work for myself now as a barrister, and I'm trying to be a good boss to myself. So I try to give myself some time off when I need it. My experience of being an employee was challenging. I used to work in a legal service where I had an incredible boss. And he was very supportive of me, and he would let me openly talk about my period without flinching too much, which was really important for me. But I, like so many other people who have difficulties with their period, I was constantly out of leave. So I would get unwell and take sick leave. I would also just get the normal bouts of illness that sick leave is meant for, like I would get a stomach bug or I would get a cold, and I would become unwell. And then I ended up in a situation where I was booked in for 2 surgeries quite unexpectedly, one after the other, and I completely ran out of leave. So I was at a point where I was looking at taking unpaid leave in order to have surgery, and then that gives you all kinds of difficulties with how do you pay the rent and the like. Now I'm really privileged. I'm a lawyer. I'm white. I'm cisgender. A lot of things are going my way, but the fact that it could even affect me that badly, where I was incredibly stressed out about the fact that I'd run out of leave, I think is probably pretty illustrative for the way it affects so many people in the workplace, but probably far more than me.
And that's one of the findings we discovered when there were over 400 survey participants that indicated that a majority had taken off at least 6+ days per year of their sick leave entitlements. So yes, I'm sure it's very common, unfortunately, Gemma. So Mary, as an employer at the Victorian Women's Trust, you introduced paid menstrual leave as a policy several years ago now. So tell us about what led up to the implementation. So what were the discussions and the consultation that preceded its introduction? I think you're on mute, Mary.
There it is, that COVID thing. Unmute yourself. Thanks, Shannon. Look, we started work in this area in 2013, actually, almost a decade ago, and four leading menstrual educators came into us at the Women's Trust, and I asked them what they most wanted, and they said they wanted a sort of certificate to be credentialed as menstrual educators. And I sort of listened and sort of leant forward and said, look, surely we can do a lot more than that. And we had a great time, that group and myself. When I came out and my staff was saying it sounded like a fun meeting, there's a lot of laughter and whatever, I said, well, I think we might be embarking on this amazing journey about menstruation and menopause. And there was amongst the younger staff was sort of a little bit of a nervous, not a giggle, but a sort of nervousness of, well, why would you want to do that? And so I make that point early to say that just because we were largely an all-female staff, it didn't mean to say that we had reached this position of nirvana when it comes to openness and a positive menstrual culture. Our office was bearing the brunt even then of the way the menstrual taboo works across our society. Anyhow, the long and short of it is that we embarked on this project. We got some philanthropic backing. We surveyed over 3,500 people, mainly from Australia, although there's quite a representation from different parts of the world. We conducted 22 discussion groups across the state, all age groups, from teenagers right through to people experiencing menopause. And it was quite revealing, in part shocking. I expected that a lot of respondents would nominate menstruation menopause as something really awkward and embarrassing and something to be ashamed of and something to remain silent about, just get on with it, put up with it. But what did surprise me was that it didn't matter which age cohort we spoke of or listened to, that younger women, late teenagers and so on, they, even though they were savvy and so much more savvy than I was at their age, but they were still victims of the menstrual taboo in terms of awkwardness and shame and ignorance, just not understanding the way we cycle and so on. So that research fundamentally then led to the publication of About Bloody Time, which we released, I think, in 2019, and which I might add is now being translated into German in Germany, such as the acclaim it's been subjected to. But it was really through the writing of that we just had this dawning recognition that if we were serious about what we had discovered through that research and writing, and writing like terriers, we wrestled to the ground this menstrual taboo, because if women in particular have been so silenced by centuries and centuries about their cycling system, then it's not easy to dismantle the taboo. You have to actually unpack why is something that is physiologically has integrity, despite endometriosis and other problems, but the system is quite awesome in so many physiological ways. So why is it so socially and culturally demeaned? So we set out to answer that question about the taboo in the book. But we then decided if we were serious, then we had to actually take the lessons for our small office. And so in 2017, two of our younger staff were charged to develop the menstrual policy, and we took it right through to board, and we've had it in place ever since. And we haven't looked back, and I think we'll be able to talk about that later. But that was the impetus, that it came out of a research program, but through that research, just the wool falling away from our own eyes.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Mary. So Kate, I'd like to jump to you next. So tell us about the menstrual and reproductive leave campaign that is being pursued by HACSU.
Sure, thanks Shannon. So HACSU have launched our women's plan last Friday, and part of that plan is reproductive health and wellbeing leave. What we've seen in previous years, I suppose, around International Women's Day is women have to speak louder, you know, voice your opinions, don't be scared to say what you want, demand things. However, this year, I feel like we've seen a real shift. Why should we speak louder? Why should we demand these things when they should already be a given? What we want to do is change the dynamic of the workplace where we don't have to yell and shout to get our views across or to say what we need. We really need to change the foundation of the workplace. And we feel that our reproductive health and wellbeing leave may go some way to help do that. We started off talking about women taking leave for the purposes of menstruation and symptoms related to menopause as well. You know, we know that the stats show that 45% of women report that dealing with menopausal symptoms lead them to wanting to retire earlier than they would, simply because of the side effects that menopause has. Similarly, those like Gemma who have regular and systematic pain that they cannot physically get out of bed without vomiting or curling up in a ball, people cannot work, and the embarrassment that women were reporting by saying, I can't go to work today because I've had a really bad night's sleep, I've got the night sweats, or I can't get out of bed today because I physically cannot stand up due to my period. We started looking at that, and then our members came to us and said, well, what about me? I've got severe endometriosis. What about me? I've got polycystic ovaries. And what about me? I've been going through IVF, injecting all these hormones into my body, having to take huge amounts of time off. How can we be included? So that's why we decided to expand it to reproductive health and wellbeing. So anything to do with your reproductive system, whether it's you know, trying to get pregnant through IVF, whether it's you're suffering from endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome, which we ended up changing rather than putting in the actual diagnosis in the clause, because we know, and I'm sure Gemma can attest to this, that it takes so long for a woman to be diagnosed with endometriosis, and then so long again to be able to get the publicly funded help to treat that condition, that we didn't want people who are suffering from endometriosis to have to wait until they've got official diagnosis for the employer to recognise that they do need reproductive health and wellbeing leave. So we changed those words to women or people who suffer bleeding or severe pain, therefore eliminating the fact that you actually need a diagnosis of endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome or something similar. And what we wanted to do is have extra days leave, because as was pointed out previously, it is still the case in 2022 that women are still seen as the primary caregiver when it comes to children, and also to, for instance, elderly parents or the like. So we use a lot of our carers leave for those things, and we use our sick leave, as Gemma pointed out, when we have, especially in COVID times, where you have a sniffle and you've got to take time off work because, you know, you don't want to infect the whole office. So sick leave's being used for those sorts of things, as it should be. However, going through IVF, having endometriosis, having severe bleeding or pain due to that are of a reproductive nature, you're not sick. You shouldn't have to take personal leave for that reason. We wanted to introduce days off where you could have to deal with your reproductive health and well-being, but not only we also want to step further. It's not only days off, but it's also introducing the flexible working arrangements. So, you know, having the ability to maybe start a bit later, or having the ability to, you know, have access to a cooler area, or you know, more breaks so that you can go to the bathroom more regularly, those sorts of things as well. So we're very excited that the Victorian government's actually talking to HACSU about this, and we hope that it does come into public policy. We know some private companies are doing it and doing it well, but it should be available to absolutely everyone. And as Mary quite rightly said, we need to break that stigma. There's nothing wrong in going in and saying to your boss, I've had severe bleeding, I can't come in, I'm not working today. We really need to break that stigma. There's nothing shameful about what our bodies do naturally. And we really want to break down those walls and just make it part of an everyday entitlement that you get. So when, you know, I've got 2 daughters, when my daughters enter the workplace, they know they're going to get long service leave, annual leave, personal leave, and reproductive health and wellbeing leave. And I don't ever want my daughters to be ashamed of the fact that they menstruate, nor should they be. And we really need to break down that narrative right here and right now with this generation.
Very well said, Kate. It's good to see HACSU being super active in that space. In terms of the kind of your membership approaching you about this issue, I'd imagine that it would be very difficult at times to spread the word about menstrual leave, to empower members to actually come to their bargaining reps to say, this is actually what I want, because I'd imagine a lot of female workers don't even know that's something they can demand. So from your perspective as an official at HACSU, how do you overcome that issue and ensure that that issues are member-led at the end of the day, and that it is a bottom-up approach and not necessarily a top-down approach?
Absolutely. So this whole idea of reproductive health and wellbeing leave came from our members, actually at an International Women's Day event, and we developed the policy with Tanya Kovac as well, who's been a great support and help in this space. At every point, we've gone back to members and said, this is what we're asking for in enterprise bargaining agreement negotiations. It is incredibly hard to get that point across. In most cases, I mean, we're still doing the mental health agreement currently. In most situations, I'm the only female in that bargaining. So, you know, I'm the one that has to be, for lack of a better word, bolshy in saying, you know, you've got people who are 75% of the workforce. It's a caring industry. It's predominantly female. You've got women who can be severely incapacitated, cannot go to work due to pain, due to severe bleeding. I mean, we spoke to a specialist where she's had women come in with their standard periods but needing blood transfusions because they've lost so much blood. Do you want these people on your hospital floor looking after people when they can barely stand? They are coping through the day by topping up Nurofen whenever they can. It's absolutely appalling. And they sit there and say, oh, no, I understand, but, you know, you guys will be right. You've been doing it for a while now. We've been doing it for a while now because we've had to do it for a while now. You know, we shouldn't have to go through such severe pain and blood loss at work and not get the assistance we need to be the best workers we can be. I hate to think, but if men got periods, we would not be having this conversation. This would be implemented and it would be done. The workforce even now is built around men. I mean, I even found out the other day, when you walk into an office, the standard office temperature is for that of a 40-year-old, 70-kilo male. You know, those sorts of things are really work against the females in the workforce. And we really need to start designing a workforce that is for absolutely everyone, that makes everyone's equal. Everyone has the right to speak up and say, this is what's ailing me at the moment. This is why I need time off, so I can come back to work and be the best employee I can be. And our members have been, both male and female, I might add, have been 100% behind this clause, have added to it. You know, we've added in the IVF as we've gone, we've added in and one, I might say, a clause around pregnancy loss. So, you know, having a miscarriage or a termination before that 20-week mark, you know, actually being able to say to someone, hey, I'm pregnant and I lost the baby, rather than keeping your mouth shut up. And I hate this, keeping your mouth shut up to 12 weeks and not being able to say, hey, I'm pregnant, and then losing the baby, and you are so alone because no one knows what you are actually going through. You know, the masses of bleeding that you have after a miscarriage or termination. So we were lucky enough to win days off for both the person who was pregnant and their partner, if they indeed have one, to actually cope with that loss, both the physical things that come from having a miscarriage or a termination, but also the mental load that puts on people as well. So we're moving in the right direction, and our members have been absolutely great. They've taken stop work action, they've implemented protected action bans to really get the Victorian government to listen, and it's slowly starting to happen, which we're very excited about.
Yep, that's great to hear. So we've kind of touched on a number of ways that menstrual leave or reproductive leave more broadly has been implemented. So from the Victorian Women's Trust perspective, it was via a policy, if I'm not mistaken. HACS were promoting menstrual and reproductive leave through enterprise agreements. Throughout the report, in the research phase, our team were considering pushing for amendment to the National Employment Standards and the Fair Work Act. We thought that our attempts at lobbying the coalition government were probably quite futile in that space. Gemma, I'd like to go to you to consider what the discrimination implications are for the implementation of menstrual leave. So on one side, can you imagine a plausible argument by male workers who can advance the claim that menstrual leave is direct discrimination on the basis of sex or gender? And in the alternative, do you think that the current NES leave entitlements for workers could constitute indirect discrimination because all workers are afforded the same amount of leave entitlements, irrespective of their diverse needs?
Yeah, I might start with the second part. So I think from my perspective, you know, as a law nerd, it's kind of interesting to think about the ways in which you might use the law to try and get employers to take this kind of stuff on. And I think there is a really interesting question about whether applying the same blanket rule to everyone in terms of leave could be indirectly discriminating against people. I mean, my example, you know, my life, my work when I was an employee is kind of a case in point. I had a very supportive manager, and I was in a workplace that is pretty roundly considered to be a utopia for women and queer lawyers. But the system, just the normal system that applied to everyone, left me far worse off than it left my cisgender male colleagues, to the point where I had a lot of them, especially when I had to have that second surgery that was quite unexpected, and I was really stressing out about my leave. I had a couple of my cis male colleagues say to me, I wish I could give you some of my sick leave. I've actually racked up whatever it was, 60 days that's just sitting there that I don't need. So, you know, it wasn't that anyone there was, you know, being malicious or doing the wrong thing on purpose, but the way that the system operated very clearly left me at a disadvantage, and other people who had periods, you know, also ran much lower on sick leave than everyone else. So I think that there is a notion that those kind of things mean that it is discriminatory. The fact that it's enshrined in the National Employment Standards means that it's kind of a complicated legal question, because it kind of goes a little bit above the employers. But I think in particular, I think there's a potential argument, and I think probably the strongest argument is in relation to flexible work arrangements, because employers have got obligations to make reasonable adjustments for their employees. And I think, you know, there's kind of a few parts to this puzzle, right? One is about dismantling, you know, prejudice and stigma that comes with menstruation. Another one is, you know, about looking at giving people time off if they need it. But I think a third piece that probably doesn't get enough airtime, but probably should, because we've just been through it all throughout the COVID pandemic, is the ability to work from home or work different hours, or for instance, take some time off one week but load up the next week if that's what suits you better. And I think there is a pretty decent argument that not facilitating that stuff in particular could constitute indirect discrimination. And it's interesting because there's been a case in the federal court that ruled that endometriosis and dysmenorrhea, which basically means painful periods, are disabilities for the purposes of the Disability Discrimination Act. So we've got a pretty good starting point for discrimination lawyers. It's a good thing to have in your back pocket if you're negotiating with an employer. And I think that it will be a really interesting area for litigation going forward. I think, you know, as we kind of start to dismantle the stigma, hopefully we'll end up with more kind of cases like this running, because people will feel emboldened to talk to someone about what their rights are and potentially to run legal challenges. So I see it as a really interesting area that's potentially ripe for litigation, and hopefully we can, you know, run those kind of cases and get good outcomes, because you know, the law is only one tool. Often it's a very blunt tool, often it doesn't work, but I think as part of a suite of kind of things that people are pushing to get change, I think it's definitely something to keep in the toolbox when it comes to negotiating with employers about this kind of stuff. As to the first part of your question about whether it could be discrimination against cisgendered men, all I'm just going to say is no.
You don't want to give anyone any ideas.
Yeah, exactly. If we've got the men's rights activists on the line and they want some legal advice, just say no. Just don't do it. Yeah. At
least not in the week that coincides with International Women's Day.
Oh, that's when it would happen. Let's face it.
Yeah, you're not wrong. So Mary, I'd like to jump to you and talk about what the nuts and bolts of the menstrual leave policy are. So what is it? What kind of form does it take? What are the notice and evidence requirements, if any? Is it paid leave? What's the uptake been? What's the feedback been from employees at the Victorian Women's Trust?
Sure, thank you. I guess the the most important thing in all of this, and I think Kate hinted at it too, is that the simple message and the powerful message is that why should women have to ring up their manager or someone else in their workplace and make an excuse that they've got a migraine or their kid's sick or something? They have to make an excuse for the fact that they're not feeling well enough to attend the workplace. And so they're encouraged, or, you know, the incentive is there to actually obfuscate, when in fact it's not an illness. It's not an illness, unless, of course, you're experiencing particular situations around the cycle. But so for us, we opted for a simple three-part thing which touches on what Gemma's just said. So the first position in our policy is that if you wake up and you're feeling crappy, or the first day of a bleed or whatever, then, and but you feel as though you can be at work, or if the symptoms become more severe at work, then the first part of our leave policy is that you have permission to move around, to seek somewhere else in your workplace which is going to give you more physical comfort. So you could go and lie down somewhere with a hot water bottle and your laptop. The second proposition is that if you wake up on that morning and you do feel that you could be productive, but my God, you feel really crappy, then you can stay at home and work, and your remote working from home policy kicks in rather than menstrual leave per se. But the third proposition is if you're feeling so crappy that you just can't imagine kicking in any productive way that day, then you are entitled to up to 12 days paid leave per year. So our menstrual leave is not just about paid days off. It's actually about recognition you can be supported in two other ways as well. And back to Kate's point about, you know, a lot of our workplaces, they're not set up to be comfortable for somebody who's actually going through hot flushes, going through menopause, or going through a painful period. The temperature's wrong, you know, the place is stuffy, your workplace doesn't encourage you just to get out and stroll around and get a few breaths of fresh air and so on. So our leave policy is threefold, and what we've found since in the 5 years is that, and it's a small office, but what we've found is that on average, our staff are using the 12 paid leave provisions about 50% of the time. So no one is using up to 12 days leave. And you know, I've been advising companies and NGOs since that, you know, if you think 12 days is going to frighten the horses, then you could in fact opt to come in at, say, 6 days of paid leave a year, in the knowledge that that's still going to probably be fairly sufficient for most of the people concerned. One thing I just wanted to say too about the stigma, you know, it's what we found is that one of the most common reasons why girls truant from school is because they're menstruating and they're embarrassed and they're awkward and they're not supported in the school environment. So our issue here is not just getting it right in workplaces, but getting it right in families, in schools, in sports communities. And that hinges on us being able to smash the taboo, kick it out of the park, and actually replace it with a culture that is positive about menstruation and menopause. So Shannen, our point is that it's not a surprise that our employees have loved it. They feel as though management comes from a place of care, as well as a desire to be efficient and productive. I think they pay us back in terms of loyalty and support and trust and faith. They're much more open with one another. It's not uncommon for me to walk past a conversation where two of the younger staff are having a quick conversation about which menstrual cup is better than the other. And I listen to that longingly, thinking of what it was like, you know, when I was in my 20s, grappling with these sorts of issues, especially coming out of a convent. So the atmosphere is more supportive. We have a supply of free menstrual products in our bathroom, just in case someone gets caught short. The couple of men who work in our office, it's been really interesting and lovely to see them understand that this is no stigma thing, this is no mystery, and I think it aids the respect that people can have amongst one another. So I see nothing but benefits. When we first launched our policy and we got publicity, for example, on the project, and we read all of the comments that came through, and it was quite interesting. There was a binary response, and essentially it was gendered. Essentially, a lot of men were saying, oh, for God's sake, what next? Suck it up, princesses. And most of the female response was, oh, thank God. Thank God somebody's coming along and starting to breathe some oxygen into this debate for the better. But I can talk a little bit more later, if you like, about what I think is a really thrilling wave of reform that is now breaking in this country.
That was going to be my next question, because it's great to hear that, you know, when there was that consultation period at the beginning of the research for About Bloody Time, you notice that particularly the younger female workers were a little bit shy about talking about menstruation and menopause, but now you're overhearing conversations about what's the best menstrual cup. So just hearing that kind of that cyclical impact of the policy and the attitude change is, yeah, that's really great to hear. I think that there's just anecdotally seeing the kind of switch in public discourse around menstruation and menopause, I've noticed there has been a bit of a switch, I think, especially with the work done in the endometriosis awareness space. So I would like to throw it out to all three panelists about what kind of reform we're seeing taking shape in broader society, and what kind of action we can take to capitalise off of that wave.
I wonder if I could just make a start, because I've got an email while we've been on this panel. I've had an email notification come through on my right-hand side here about somebody who wants to talk to me about a workshop with their staff on menstruation and menopause. My point at the moment, Shannen, is that not a week would go by in the last several years, not a week goes by without an inquiry into us at the Women's Trust about how to actually start the conversations and the dialogue around a positive menstrual culture. So I have anecdotal evidence. There are large not-for-profits. There are people in the corporate world. There are women wanting to take it up in their workplaces. I did an interview on International Women's Day with Radio National, generated feedback from all over the country of people now wanting to run with this. Future Super became the first superannuation fund to introduce a menstrual policy, and they derived that from our template, which is on our website. The template on our website is one of the most visited sites on our website. There is such a energy for reform in this area, because people know that it's just filled with common sense. And the most important thing that we, and it goes to Gemma's early introductory comments, is that one of the benefits of positive menstrual culture is that women cycling bodies are encouraged to take more care of themselves. So it's as much about sensible self-care. I mean, if I had my time again, I would have gone through menopause much more sensibly and talking openly and honestly with my partner and my daughters, and I would have made a better time of it for myself. It just wouldn't have been the kind of burden it was. So I think that ability to understand what is happening, because one of our research findings was that women go through their lives fairly uninformed, actually, about this incredible physiological cycle. So the encouragement to become informed and to look after oneself and to be able to have these honest conversations with people that we're connected with and in our workplace, that's the kind of the wonderful, thrilling thing that's now happening across our society, I think. And I reckon in about 7 or 8 years' time, we'll be looking back and saying, well, it took us a couple of 100 years, but hey, look at the wave of change that has been institutionalised.
I think coupling the awareness raising and breaking the stigma, coupling that with tangible policies that benefit workers to enable to simultaneously break that stigma is really crucial. So it's great to hear that you, Mary, and Victorian Women's Trust are facilitating that. So thanks so much for sharing that. To Kate and Gemma, did you want to share more about what you perceive as perhaps a social, political discourse shift regarding this space?
I guess I can give my experiences, which is I don't want to focus on the individual to say that really we just need to take this all on individually and it's each of our problems to make everything better. I think that fundamentally it's a systemic issue. It cuts across employment, the medical, the whole medical sector. What Mary was saying about encouraging self-care. I've done a lot of work with a psychologist who I work on in part to do with dealing with pain. And she has really tried to encourage me to think about what I'm asking for when I'm talking to people about how I'm going. She pointed out that I have a real tendency to talk about the fact that I'm feeling a bit unwell. And I'm not feeling a bit unwell. I'm so sick that I've been up vomiting in the nighttime just from the pain. I can't get out of bed and I certainly can't do my job. But I say I'm feeling a bit unwell and I might need to not come in. you know, as an example, and she's really tried to get me to work on explaining I'm unwell and I need to take today off, I'll be in tomorrow, that kind of thing. So, you know, that all comes from a lot of medical gaslighting and, you know, other experiences that you have when a whole system tells you that you're the problem and, you know, makes you only have individual responsibility for your situation. And so I think that the work that you guys have done, Shannen, and I know that you've introduced your excellent report by really focusing on us and what we think about everything, but just for a moment, I think it's really important that we turn the spotlight back onto what you've done by putting a lot of time and energy into writing something that's being put out publicly. I think it's incredibly powerful in trying to shift the dynamic in workplaces, in politics, in medicine, because really those are the things that need to change in order to bring about, I think, a meaningful difference for people who have periods. So if I can just end on that from my perspective, well done on spending all of the time that you've spent on this, and wholehearted congratulations. I'm one very proud mentor to have had a very small part in all of the work that you have ploughed into, I think, making some kind of meaningful difference in this area.
Great, thanks so much for that, Gemma. That means a lot coming from you, so thanks so much for that. I think what you were talking about before about shifting the onus from the individual responsibility, that was something that underpinned the drafting phases of our report, because we didn't want to adopt an assimilationist model of employment whereby people who endure menstrual pain, symptoms and conditions should just simply have to put up with what's being offered, which is, as has been pointed out throughout the panel, is for your 40-year-old 70-kilogram male who has very little care or parenting responsibilities, who's racking up hundreds of hours of personal leave. So I think that hopefully as people read through the report, that anti-assimilationist philosophy is quite evident and can inspire you all to demand more and not have to put up with what's currently on offer.
Yeah. One thing I would add, Shannen, is that from my perspective, with all of that in mind, I would encourage anyone who's listening to this panel to speak loudly and fearlessly if they feel that they can do that safely about their periods and their experiences of the difficulties that come with it. I have found it to be amazing when you start those conversations in workplaces, the way it encourages other people to also similarly open up. So that's my one little individualist kind of asterisk on the fact that really what we need is system change. We also need people to be brave and bold in talking about their experiences when they can do so.
Yes, good point. Thanks, Gemma. Kate, do you have any thoughts about this or any closing comments you'd like to make?
I guess for us, the industrial rights to take menstrual leave, reproductive health and wellbeing leave, is of vital importance. But what also needs to be there is the publicly funded women's health. And I think this is what's missing across all of Australia. We spoke to one of my treating specialists, and I'm lucky enough to have had in the past private health insurance, which meant I could access her in a timely manner. But she was saying that if I was diagnosed with endometriosis and then was referred to see a women's health specialist in the public system, I'd be waiting for 3.5 years to get in to see someone, and that's in Victoria. We know that in WA, for instance, it's a 5-year wait for any sort of postnatal care in the public system. So your kid's at school before you have access to medical treatment to assist you. We really need the federal government to stand up and invest in women's health, because if you invest in women's health, you're investing in them in the workplace, you're investing them in society. And what is happening now is just not good enough. It is disgraceful that women and women's health are still treated as second class. It's just not good enough, and we need and HACSU are doing our part where we're going out, we're speaking to federal MPs to really highlight the fact that, yes, you throw a few $1 million here and that's not enough. You need to really invest in women having access to quality public health, enabling them to get diagnosis and treatment a hell of a lot quicker than what they're able to at the moment, because this lack, the time that goes past is just, as Gemma said, it's just debilitating, and it's just not good enough in a first world country like Australia to have women still treated as second-class citizens in the health sphere.
Thank you, Kate. Mary, Gemma, do we have any final comments that you'd like to make before closing?
Mary, I think you're on mute, Mary, but I did see the book come
Yeah.
up.
I want to put in a plug for About Bloody Time. You can order it from our website, the Women's Trust. It's subtitled The Menstrual Revolution We Have to Have. And I guess why I'd love you to go to it is that I think one of the first things to be doing in pressing for reform like this is to ground yourself in a really great framework of why the change, of why we need to do it. And I know this is a bit like, the Pope saying the Bible's a good thing, but I actually think that the treatment of the menstrual taboo in this book is one of the best you'll find anywhere. It's been written about a lot in academic circles over many, many years, but this is a robust, rigorous, plain speak treatment of how we live our lives over centuries oppressed by this taboo, and then we put a case as to why we just have got to dismantle it and how that can be done. So I'd really go to the source, read it, acquaint yourself with the issues and the argument, and take it from there.
Thanks, Mary. It's a really great resource. I remember going to the book launch a few years ago now at the very beginning of our research part of the report, and it was very inspiring. It's a great educative tool. Even as a young woman who is an adult, I learnt a lot from reading that. So thank you for that, Mary. Gemma.
I was just going to say that while we're plugging things, I believe that the report has been put in the chat, and I would really encourage everyone to have a look. There's a couple of questions that have come through that I can see, and one of them, for instance, is about how it's gone around the world, and is Australia a leader? And what I can say is, you can read about that in the report, because these guys have put a lot of effort into it, and it does touch on the situation internationally, and Australia is not a leader, but hopefully we can become a leader in this area if things continue down the path that we would all like to see it go down.
Yes, thank you, Gemma. Okay, well, thank you all so much for attending. Big shout out to you three panelists. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat about menstruation, menopause, and menstrual leave. It's been really great, and thank you all to the attendees for coming along. We hope this can inspire you to push for change in your workplace.